All right, hello everyone, and thank you for tuning in once again to the Black Box Podcast, BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. Well, what can we say? The Democratic Party is at a very pivotal moment right now, where they got to be making some decisions about what kind of candidate are they going to be putting up in the 2020 general election to challenge Donald Trump. And there are just so many in the race now. It's like we tried to cover most of them on this channel, but we haven't done anything about Julian Castro or Pete Buttigieg. But I guess we've really focused in on a handful of the primary challengers, as well as some sort of kind of outline candidates like John Delaney. And I thought this would be a really good opportunity to talk about John Delaney's platform in comparison to somebody like Bernie Sanders. Because let's face it, Bernie Sanders is in the race, he is in it to win it. He has probably the biggest chance at being president right now. I repeat, right now, bigger than he's ever had in his entire life. Well, this is just the decision that the Democratic voters are going to have to make. Do they want to go with a moderate, or do they want to go with someone far left? Someone who is more progressive, or someone who is just more centrist? It's a very big split in the Democratic Party right now. Because when I talk about this in political discussion groups, what I hear is that a lot of the progressives refuse to accept that there are members of the Democratic Party that are just not in line with Bernie Sanders. There are members of the Democratic Party that are just not staunch progressives. Democrat is just a party name. You can have people all up and down the spectrum. You're going to have, yes, progressive far left Democrats, but then you're also going to have kind of more centrist or even right leaning Democrats like Senator Joe Manchin and the people that would be voting for Joe Manchin. I come from West Virginia, so I can name a few. And I mean, we've all encountered conservative Democrats in our life, they exist. And those are the people that are opposed to Bernie's platform. But what do the Democrats have to do? What decision do they have to make? Because you got to look at the question, why would anybody be opposed to Bernie Sanders' platform? Some people just seem to lump Bernie Sanders in with Venezuelan socialism, and it's not only just trolls on the internet. Even Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is trying to sort of draw the comparison. But it's like Bernie Sanders calls himself a democratic socialist, and people really try to use that against him. And in all seriousness, when you listen to Bernie's platform and when you listen to Bernie talk about his talk and his speeches, he says very clearly he is not in line with, like Nicolas Maduro's socialism. He doesn't even want to be called a socialist. He says very clearly democratic socialism, and it's sort of his own brand. And what I heard from him very clearly at his speech at Georgetown University back in 2015, he said what he wanted was, why he calls himself a democratic socialist was, it just means that the people who are running the government make decisions that benefit the people. The people in the government make decisions that benefit the people. That's just what Bernie wanted. That's what he claims his vision was. But I've talked about Bernie Sanders on this channel before, and I would say that to run for president, it probably takes a certain amount of also being a somewhat of a opportune political thinker. You have to be an opportunistic politician all the same, and somebody like Bernie has his own agenda. He wants to win. So yes, of course, I mean, people think he's a genuine believer. They think he really cares about everything he's saying. But at the same time, he also wants to be president of the United States. So, I mean, we always take everybody's platform with a grain of salt. And somebody once asked me about like why I sound so pessimistic when I talk about politicians, why I think that everybody is a liar. And I was like, it's not that everybody's a liar. I don't necessarily think that. It's just that I am skeptical of politicians. I am skeptical of people who want to obtain power, no matter what side of the spectrum, left, right, libertarian, green, no matter what. Yeah, I am skeptical of that. Some of the differences between people like Bernie Sanders and John Delaney really come to focus on healthcare. Like, if you want to look at John Delaney's platform, he proposed the universal public-private plan. Bernie Sanders, of course, wants Medicare for all, single payer, something of that nature. The $32 trillion plan that everybody talks about. John Delaney's plan would cost $13 trillion, 1 3, and he claims that everybody would be able to be covered. It would be a universal public private plan, meaning that there is public health care, but if you don't want it, if you think that it's insufficient, then you can purchase your own private health insurance, and then employers can get tied into this. But one of the ways that you finance the public private plan is that you do it with patient co-pays, like the ordinary citizen will pay some into it. So my biggest concern with that is just they haven't revealed anything about the percentages that people would be paying, for the doctor's visits, for surgeries, for medication. Those numbers aren't really out there, and I don't think they would be until John Delaney actually put this thing into motion. And you're going to be getting stuff all up and down the board. And I talked about this example once, so excuse me if anyone's heard this before on this channel, but I was like, what exactly do they mean by financing it with copays? If your medication costs $100 and your copay is $91, they would be like, yeah, you have access to healthcare and you have access to medication, but that doesn't help you at all. $100 medication, $91 copay. And that's an extreme hypothetical example, but the whole point is they haven't revealed how much people would have to pay. But that's a $13 trillion plan. I would just kind of ask that to anybody who's listening right now. Do you think that that is something that would actually be an improvement upon what we have now? An improvement over the ACA? This kind of universal public private plan? And it's not only John Delaney, it is also Amy Klobuchar who has endorsed the universal public private plan. Once again, these two individuals, Representative John Delaney and Senator Amy Klobuchar, are for universal health care. They just want to do public private as opposed to Medicare for all. And it's a big split in the Democratic Party. But John Delaney's biggest reason for supporting this plan is because he's saying that it's less than half the cost of Bernie's plan, 13 trillion as opposed to 32 trillion. It What Delaney is trying to say with his entire political platform is not only does he want to be putting forward ideas that are going to be functioning and that are much easier to implement, and definitely easier to implement in a divided Congress, but Delaney is also about bipartisan unification. He is about trying to become the unifying force. And I had that one of those silly ideas once when I was like, what if that were true? I mean, just think about that for a second. What if John Delaney, the absolute long shot candidate, I mean, you would think that somebody like John Delaney doesn't stand a chance in the world of being president, but I was like, what if there was actually some truth to that? What if John Delaney was the single best person to unify the country? I repeat, unify that, like a president that everyone could look toward. The reason I thought that is because, to be honest, even though Bernie is really energizing a lot of the progressives, he's also polarizing the situation by pushing the right wingers away from him. And once again, it's just kind of keeping up with the same old divisive rhetoric, but divisive on the other end. Granted, I would say that Bernie Sanders' plans are, the rhetoric of Bernie Sanders is not as hurtful as Donald Trump, and I don't think anyone, left or right, would disagree with that. Absolutely, Bernie is less. I mean, he is less abrasive than Donald Trump, and like even if you don't say want to use the word hurtful, they would say Bernie is less abrasive. Absolutely, absolutely, I would say that. But the point is, Bernie's not running a unification campaign. Bernie is not running a bipartisan campaign. Absolutely not. And this is the thing that we were talking about, the decision that the Democrats have to make. Do you try and unify the country, or do you do what some other people have been talking about when they're just like, the Democrats need somebody far left. They need somebody who is a staunch progressive. They're like, they're only going to have change in the country. We are only going to have change in the country if we put in a staunch progressive who is actually going to be able to implement these progressive policies. History is not decided by the moderates, like being opposed to slavery, being opposed to only men having the right to vote, the people who were champions of universal suffrage, the people who were champions of equality, the people who were champions of just abolitionism. Those were progressive ideas. They weren't moderate and they weren't centrist. Those were staunch progressive ideas. That's the argument that's going forward. So they're like, we cannot put another moderate centrist like Delaney in the White House because it's just going to continue the status quo. And that is one of the big things that, I mean, moderate centrism is almost in line with. You might say that conservatism is more in line with preserving the status quo. That's what you're conserving, right? That's why it's called conservatism. You conserve the status quo, you're preserving how things are. So moderate centrism isn't too far away, and someone like John Delaney isn't necessarily. I mean, John Delaney's not a right winger, absolutely not. I mean, he has very passionate stances about many things. He's pro gay marriage. I mean, and even supporting universal health care is not a conservative idea. No, no. I mean, John Delaney has some progressive sides to him. But when you want to look at differ, I thought it was very good when Delaney flat out kind of gave an honest answer about, do you support reparations for slavery? And he was just like, he used a little bit of politician speak, but he's just sort of saying, what we need to do is redefine our educational system, for everybody. But I don't support cash payments. I don't support cash reparations. And Bernie Sanders was dealt with the same question at his CNN town hall, and he gave sort of says, you've been very much opposed to this in the past, and Bernie gave kind of a double talk answer. And I know some Bernie supporters wouldn't even want to hear that something like that. Oh no, Bernie didn't give a double talk answer. You gotta call somebody out when they need to improve upon something. You gotta call it as you see it. Because that's the problem with like the Bernie camp. I mean, I don't have anything against Bernie Sanders. I mean, I honestly think that the Fox News crowd really tries to misrepresent him. But sometimes you have to call him out. You cannot think that your candidate is perfect. And that is what I'm seeing from a lot of Bernie supporters on social media. Is even the refusal to listen to other candidates. It's like, I just don't think that that's a good political strategy. That's almost just like blind following. And that's not what the Democrats are going to need to challenge Donald Trump. Can Bernie Sanders win the election? I'd say yes. I'd say it's possible. Can John Delaney win the election? Let's just use that. This is just a sort of total thought experiment. If John Delaney, the representative from the 6th Congressional District in Maryland, could he win the presidential election? My first answer is, in kind of a fragmented way, when you look at sort of all the prediction sites and those, like, what if the election were held today tracking sites, they say flat out no. They all have Trump winning in a landslide over Delaney. I haven't seen all of them, I should say. The ones I have seen are like Trump would defeat John Delaney in the election. But what we learned from 2016 was those polls don't necessarily mean anything. And it was Thomas Sowell, of all people, who said back in the 1980s, like many Americans, I have never once spoken to a pollster. But I mean, the predictions, even though I just kind of discredited them to a certain extent, at the same time, where are they getting their stuff from? They're really pushing that John Delaney would not be able to defeat Donald Trump. But you got to sort of look at somebody like Delaney. He doesn't necessarily have the ability to mesmerize the general public. He doesn't have the ability to kind of win over the crowds. He doesn't have the ability to just kind of exert his influence over the Democratic Party, which is what he wants to do. That's his ambition, but it's not necessarily succeeding. If you just look at his social media accounts, I mean, he's putting stuff out on Twitter and Instagram, getting like less than 100 reactions most of the time. And even like some of the other minor candidates that we mentioned, Pete Buttigieg, Julian Castro, they get thousands of people retweeting their stuff and, of course, liking and favoriting their posts way more so than John Delaney. John Delaney's almost just like, it's almost just like not many people in the Democratic Party are listening. Granted, though, but like as I mentioned, since I do follow his accounts, he is very active on the trail. He is doing lots of rallies, interviews, meetings. He's on CNN a lot. They're giving him mainstream media coverage. People are listening to him, but the thing is, are they following him? Because there's an enormous difference between listening and following. And then there's even a bigger difference between following and supporting. I mean, I just don't know if there are that many John Delaney supporters out there. A lot of people are following his stuff, sure, and the hardcore political junkies, they're following everybody. But where are the John Delaney supporters? Do I even need to ask you where the Bernie Sanders supporters are? You know where the Bernie Sanders supporters are. Bernie has a huge amount of support, and a lot of people that just want him over absolutely anybody else. When we want to look at some things, though, about what could really happen, what would things be like if Joe Biden were in the race? Because as of now, this is April, early April 2019. We don't necessarily know everything about Joe Biden and what his plans are going to be. There's been some talk that Joe Biden is going to run with Stacey Abrams on the ticket and try and get the sort of first African American and first female vice president of the United States. So it's sort of like kind of the diversity quota, for lack of a better term. But what somebody really mentioned something about diversity in politics is that it's not about one person. It's not about a single individual. And these big corporations try to show off that, oh, this company now has a female CEO. And they were just saying, big deal. It's not about one person. It's not even about having a female president anymore. It's about the impact that it would have on the general population. It's about the impact that it would have on the American people. I do think that we will have a female president very soon in America. I don't know if it'll be 2020 or 2024, but it'll happen pretty quickly. And even if somebody like John Delaney were actually to get the nomination, which I don't believe he will, it's just this is all just theoretical right now. And not just theoretical, it's actually listening to the ideas. I mean, we've said a lot about John Delaney's ideas, such as the public private health care plan, not supporting cash reparations for African Americans, redefining the educational system. I mean, we've talked a lot about what John Delaney is saying. But when we want to look at the possibility, I mean, who would be a running mate for him that could actually be the sort of game changer? I mean, would he run with Tulsi Gabbard? No, that's a representative ticket. Highly unlikely. Maybe somebody like Amy Klobuchar would be a suitable running mate for him. Someone whose politics are somewhat similar. But when we have to look at the sort of overall situation in America right now, can Bernie defeat Donald Trump? I would like to say yes. Can John Delaney defeat Donald Trump? I'd say it's possible, but less likely than Bernie Sanders defeating Donald Trump. I repeat, John Delaney might be able to, but less likely. I mean, there really is a lot to say about the sort of kind of politics that Delaney is pushing. I mean, he is possibly the most center lined moderate in the race. And that's why I decided to use him as an example to compare his politics to Bernie. Delaney isn't even center left, he is a centrist moderate. He's almost right down the middle. And is that the direction that the Democrats need to go? That's kind of the whole topic for this whole recording. Do they need to go to the center or do they need to go farther to the left? To the people who would support the initial kind of idea that we mentioned, that the only way you actually make change in America is by having staunch progressives put their agenda into action, let me just ask, what would stop somebody from being opposed to the unity of the American people? What would stop somebody from getting people to just come together and work together and unify? And that's sort of what John Delaney talks about in his book, The Right Answer, where he puts forward his campaign message. It's like he wants to kind of bring about the unity of the American people. And I'm fully aware that that's just campaign talk. Lots of politicians say that. That's, I mean, if you think those are just empty words, 50-50 chance, yes. But what if that were to actually happen? That the American people had a leader that everybody could look toward. And I mentioned very clearly that Bernie Sanders would not be that candidate. Donald Trump is also not that candidate. And Donald Trump never tried to unify the American people. In fact, he did quite the opposite. But somehow it got him elected. Bernie Sanders wouldn't necessarily unify the people. It's kind of just two opposite ends of the spectrum. What John Delaney is trying to do is kind of put forward a center a moderate, centrist, bipartisan plan to be the president for everyone. And I would just ask that again. Do you think that there would be a benefit to society if the American people were unified and they all had a leader that would represent all of them? Or at least people would believe that the president was in touch with everybody. The short story I'm trying to say is, do you think a moderate centrist can unify the country? But there's a big thing to say about all these things about unity and togetherness and all of that stuff. I was listening to Lincoln Chafee once, the former presidential candidate. He was the governor of Rhode Island, senator from Rhode Island as well. And he said in 2000, the reason he voted for George W. Bush was, well, for starters, I mean, Republicans. He was a Republican at the time, partisan politics. But he said the biggest reason he voted for George W. Bush was because Bush said he wanted to be a uniter, not a divider. And I was just like, you fell for that? You spent your whole life in politics and you fell for that? I mean, obviously, he's probably just making up that as a story, being a career politician as he was. He's just making that up as a story. He's trying to just tell something to the people. He probably voted for Bush just because he's a Republican. But I began to think, though, no matter what, could there actually be a candidate that could unify the American people? I'm fully aware that candidates just throw out rhetoric. They just say things to sort of play certain cards on the political spectrum. Somebody's playing the far right card, someone's playing the far left card, someone is filling the role as the moderate centrist just so they have a different brand of politics, just so they have their own brand. I'm fully aware that that stuff happens. But a big thing to say about it is John Delaney isn't paid by anybody to say this. He isn't doing the work of anybody else's. He's not doing anyone else's bidding. For the presidential campaign, he said very clearly up until New Hampshire, he would self finance. He would finance all of these things himself. And on the one hand, that's like, well, this guy isn't bought and paid for. He is not doing the bidding of any other major corporate entity. He's not working with any sort of super PAC, and not like Beto O'Rourke when he says that he's not really working with any corporate donors, but in reality, he took more money from the fossil fuel industry than any other Democrat. No, I mean, there's actually sort of things like he's self financing his campaign. There's a different problem with Delaney. And I've said it before, but it's like that's going from oligarchy to plutocracy. Instead of having a small select group of people that run the show, we're going to be a society that is dominated by the wealthy. Donald Trump is the president of the United States, and then if John Delaney were to become the president of the United States, it would just be like you have to be mega rich to become president, and that's not what America needs. We don't need to go from a society that is run by the few and a select group to a society that is run by only the wealthy, where it's like if you're not a mega massive multimillionaire, you have no chance of being president. That's not exactly how I believe the American society should function, how the American voting system should function, how the American presidency should function. And Bernie Sanders isn't in that game. To Bernie's credit, he is not exactly an oligarch and he's not a plutocrat. He is definitely not someone who is just the richest person in Congress using his own money to fund the election. No, Bernie's taking individual contributions. And a lot of people really gave him credit for that. And that's something that I said very clearly about Bernie Sanders back in 2016. I was like, he was the only candidate out of the major, top five. We're talking about Trump and Hillary and Ted Cruz and John Kasich and Bernie Sanders. He was the only candidate that was not on the side of someone else's money. The only one. Hillary Clinton, absolutely. Donald Trump, absolutely. Donald Trump self financed his primary, but he did not self finance the general election. And it's like Bernie Sanders was just kind of in a different world. He was the only one not someone else's money. So, I mean, you got to look at these sort of things as just sort of what are the issues that are most important to you? Is it what we've said about healthcare? Is it what we've said about the sort of impact on culture, unity of the American people, or the progressive issues that can actually be put into place? is it's important to you about who's supporting the candidate financially? Is that the biggest thing? Because then you really know where their motivations are coming from. How exactly do you view that? And then ultimately, it's up to the voters. And it's going to be a very tough and nasty race. I would say, though, that I'm somewhat surprised that. Well, I guess I'm not 100% surprised that I was about to say the Democrats weren't giving John Delaney that much of a fair shake in the game, but then I was just thinking, it's politics. That's what happens. I mean, that's true. This isn't like everyone gets the same sort of, excuse me, everyone gets the same amount of time, everyone gets the same amount of money. It's a rough game. Well, that's all for me now. And what do you think? Until next time.